Happy Wednesday! You're listening to Mama Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we'll be covering the case of the Watcher House. A family thought they bought their dream house and instead started getting super creepy letters from an unknown watcher. This story may sound familiar for those of you who listen to Murder Inc. podcast, and that's because I'm using the same notes. Sorry, I didn't have time to get actually anything done with Christmas shopping, wrapping, and moving my godforsaken elf. So, since we're all here for one thing and one thing only, let's get it. The year was 2014, and it was in June when Derek and Maria Broaddus closed on their dream house in Westfield, New Jersey. The address to this dream house was 657 Blvd. This was the kind of neighborhood where neighbors actually bring pies and lasagnas and like homemade baked goods to somebody new that moves in. They closed on the house on June 2nd, 2014, right before Derek celebrated his 40th birthday. This house was massive and beautiful. It was a 6-bedroom, 3.5-bath colonial home built in 1905. I have one bathroom, and I genuinely don't know what I would do with 3.5 bathrooms in one house. But let's continue. The Broadduses paid almost $1.3 million for the house, and then they still had the money to pay a construction crew to come in and remodel the home, because obviously they can afford it. The Broadduses had 3 young kids at the time. They had a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 10-year-old. And Maria had grown up in the area, and she knew that this would be a perfect place to plant her roots, raise a family, and kind of start their life together in their forever home. John and Andrea Woods were the previous owners of the house, and they had never actually put the house up for sale. And the way things kind of fell into place during the buying process was almost like the Broadduses were supposed to live in this house. The way things kind of worked out, it was like they were supposed to be there, and it worked out perfectly. And once I get into what happened after they moved in, you kind of wonder how messed up this whole situation is, considering how things fell into place. So the Broaddus family was still living in their old house while the renovations on the new house were being done. And it was only 3 days after the purchase of the house was final that Derek went out to check on the progress of the renovations, kind of see where things were, how long this would take, how much longer we're expecting this to take. And he figured since he was already there, he would check the mail. When Derek opened the mailbox, he found regular mail, junk mail, normal things that you would find. But in the middle of all of the junk mail and regular mail, there was also another envelope inside, but it wasn't addressed to the Broadduses. Instead, it was addressed to, quote-unquote, the new owners. And even the words written on the front of the envelope that said the new owner were written in really chunky, bold lettering. And when Derek opened the envelope, he could see that this letter had been typed out, and there was no return address listed on the top. And before we keep going, the address at this house gets a little confusing. The actual address to the home is 657 Blvd. Like, Boulevard is the actual street name. So it's not like Maple Street or Clover Street. The actual street address is 657 Blvd. Derek noticed that the letter was postmarked for June 4th. So only 2 days after they actually finalized the purchase of the house. But, like I mentioned, it wasn't even public knowledge that the Broadduses had bought the house until like the 6th, I believe. Derek opened the envelope and started to read the letter. The letter read, "Dearest new neighbor at 657 Blvd, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. How did you end up here? Did 657 Blvd call to you with its forces within? 657 Blvd has been the subject of my family for decades now. And as it approaches its 110th birthday, I've been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies in the walls of 657 Blvd? Why are you here? I will find out. I see already that you have flooded 657 Blvd with contractors so that you can destroy the house as it was supposed to be. Tisk, tisk, tisk. Bad move. You don't want to make 657 Blvd unhappy. You have children. I have seen them. So far, I think there are 3 that I have counted. Do you need to fill the house with the young blood I requested? Better for me. Was your old house too small for the growing family? Or was it greed that brought me your children? Once I know their names, I will call to them and draw them to me. I asked the woods to bring me young blood, and it looks like they listened. Who am I? There are hundreds and hundreds of cars that drive by 657 Boulevard each day. Maybe I'm in one. Look at all the windows you can see from 657 Boulevard. Maybe I am in one. Look out any of the many windows in 657 Boulevard at the people who stroll by each day. Maybe I am one. Welcome, my friends. Welcome. Let the party begin. And at the bottom of this letter, it was signed in cursive, The Watcher. So I don't know about y'all, but if I had just purchased a house and within days of the purchase being finalized, I got a letter that was postmarked for before it was even public knowledge that I had bought the house, and it read like this. Oh no, I'm noping right the hell up out of that neighborhood, take my loss, burn the house, do what you gotta do. But that's not what Derek did. Derek immediately called the police to make a report about the letter. He didn't know if it was a prank or maybe one of his neighbors just messing with him. But he's a dad, so he has to think about his wife and kids. And also the fact this is super weird. This is not like a normal, postcard that you get from a neighbor that says, welcome to the neighborhood. Holler at me if you ever need to borrow a cup of sugar. No. The New Jersey officer that came out when Derek called, literally, I'm going to quote this officer. When he read the letter, he asked Derek, quote, "What the fuck is this?" And then he encouraged Derek to maybe move the big construction machinery because it may bust out a window. The officer, sir, that's not what we're worried about right now. The officer also advised Derek not to speak with or interact with any of his neighbors about the letter until he had a chance to investigate it and look into it more. Because at this point, all of the neighbors are suspects. The officer also told him not to even mention or bring up the letters to anybody, to let the police station look into it without the whole neighborhood already knowing about it. Which was probably a smart move. If it was one of the neighbors, you don't want to let them know that you're on to them, and you don't want to mention the letter to them and let them know that, police are looking into it, or else you may never figure out who's writing this weird stuff. So Derek and Maria decide they're going to get in touch with the previous owners of the house, John and Andrea Woods. They ask the Woods if they've ever gotten any weird or inconspicuous letters like this while they lived there. The Woods emailed him back the very next morning and told Derek that they had lived in that house for 23 years and had never gotten a letter like this from anyone. Which, okay. Oh, except for the one that they got on May 24th, 2014, which just so happened to be a few days before the Woodses moved out of 657 Boulevard. The letter that the Woods had gotten just basically thanked them for being good to the house and looking out for it. But it did also say that the Watcher had been watching them the entire time that they lived there too. But the Woods said that since the letter that they had gotten wasn't threatening or menacing, that they just kind of tossed it in the trash and didn't really think much about it. Which also, I don't know what I would think about getting a letter that thanked me for being good to the house that I've lived in for 23 years. I would probably find that weird and creepy, but not threatening and menacing, so I get that. But I also don't think I would have thrown it away either. The Woods even went so far as to tell the Broadduses in this email that they sent back that they had felt so safe inside that house that they rarely ever even locked their doors. So that's gotta say something. And of course, Derek had to tell his wife Maria about the letter that he had found in the mailbox, but they probably figured it was nothing, if anything, maybe a prank. Which I don't know what kind of pranks they play in New Jersey, but this would not be funny where I live. So instead of really worrying about it, the Broadduses started to move their stuff into the house. They still weren't living there. They were still staying in their old house. They were just taking things that you don't use every day, maybe decorations, stuff along those lines. And shortly after they had gotten the first letter, neighbors were stopping by to chat and to see the house after the renovations. So Derek and Maria offered to show them the inside of the house since it was almost done and it was almost ready to move into, which I don't know if I would do that. the police legit told them every neighbor is a suspect at this point. But I guess if you pay that much money for a house and that much money on renovations, you'd kind of want to show it off. I don't know. People with money, am I right? Because I read in a few places that they spent upwards of $100,000 on renovations and construction alone. So while they're giving a few of the neighbors a tour of the place, one of the neighbors says, quote, "It'll be nice to have some young blood in the neighborhood again." And that was one of the terms that were used in the letters. And I don't know tons of people that say that, maybe elderly people or older people. That would probably just skeeve me out after I had just gotten this letter that said the same exact thing. Or maybe that's just the way they talk. It could be like a product of your environment. I say yonder, a lot of people don't. Or maybe it could have been the watcher inside of their own house. I don't know for sure, but I feel like I'd be side-eyeing every single neighbor. And all was well until June 18th when Maria came to the house to look at some paint samples, and while she was there, she went ahead and went out to check the mail. And what do you know? There was another envelope that looked a lot like the first watcher letter they had gotten, and lo and behold, it was a second letter. And I read a few different things about this next letter. Some things that said that the letter listed the kids in the order that they were born, and it also listed their names and each of the 3 kids' nicknames. But I couldn't find the letter with all of that info on it. Everything I found just said daughter or, whatever. But with that being said, I couldn't find it because none of these letters have fully been released to the public. So I tried piecing them together the best that I could. I even turned to Reddit for this research, and that is one of my biggest no-no rules about researching cases, except for the Brandy Worley case, obviously. And this second letter was actually addressed to the Broaddus family, like Mr. and Mrs. Broaddus was written in thick, chunky lettering on the front, but their last names weren't spelled right. Which leads me to believe that whoever's writing these letters can hear them talking, but hasn't actually seen it spelled out on paper. So they're around them and close enough to hear them talk about it, but not close enough to them to know how to spell their last name. That's what I'm gathering from misspelling the Broaddus family when you're addressing them in a creepy-ass letter that you're sending to their new home address. The second letter read, "Welcome again to your new home at 657 Boulevard. The workers have been busy, and I have been watching you unload carfuls of your personal belongings. The dumpster is a nice touch. Have you found out what is in the walls yet? In time, you will. I am pleased to know your names now and the names of the young blood that you have brought to me. You certainly say their names often. Is your daughter the artist of the family? 657 Boulevard is anxious for you to move in. It has been years and years since the young blood ruled the hallways of the house. Have you found all the secrets it holds yet? Will your young blood play in the basement, or are they too afraid to go down there alone? I would be very afraid if I were them. It is far away from the rest of the house. If you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream. Will they sleep in the attic? Or will you all sleep on the second floor? Who has the bedroom facing the street? I will know as soon as you move in, and it will help me to know who's in which bedroom. Then I can plan better. All of the windows and doors in 657 Boulevard allow me to watch you and track you as you move through the house. Who am I? I am the watcher. And I have been in control of 657 Boulevard for the better part of 2 decades now. The Woods family turned it over to you. It was their time to move on, and they kindly sold it when I asked them to. I pass by it many times a day. 657 Boulevard is my life, my job, my obsession. And now, you are too, Broaddus family. Welcome to the product of your greed. Greed is what brought the past 3 families to 657 Boulevard. And now, it has brought you to me. Happy moving day. You know I'll be watching." Like, I'm sorry. What? Talking about their kids' names, knowing all of, knowing that one of their kids is more artsy than the rest of them. I just absolutely could not handle this. And before I researched this case in depth, I always assumed that the Woods calling, or, the house asking the Woods for young blood was like the woods outside, like nature. But I didn't realize that the name of the previous owners, their last names were Woods. So maybe the Woods were in on it. They knew about the watcher. They knew who the watcher was. They knew that the watcher wanted young blood in the house. And that's why the buying process went so smoothly and seemingly perfectly for the Broaddus family, because the Woods were supposed to get them in the house. Either way, this absolutely has to be a neighbor. Anybody can look up tax records or whatever and find Derek and Maria's names, but the kids' names wouldn't be on any of that kind of stuff. And of course, they didn't bring their kids back to the house after this. The Broaddus family was finally like, you know what? We're going to see what the hell is in these walls. So they brought in some kind of inspector to check and scan the walls, but they never found anything. So my thinking with that is that it has to be like a metaphor for the house having secrets, not so much in a literal sense of something being in the walls, but more like a figure of speech and a metaphor for the secrets that the house holds in general. And of course, after this second letter, Derek and Maria were skeptical about finishing the move-in process. They were worried for their kids' safety and their own safety. So they didn't bring anything else into the house. They were still staying at their old house, from my understanding, but still swinging by to check on the renovations and to check the mail, of course. And that's when they got the third letter on July 28th of 2014. The third letter is just as creepy as the first and second, and the third letter read, "Where have you gone to? 657 Blvd is missing you. The house is crying from all the pain it's going through. You have changed it and made it so fancy, you're stealing its history. It cries for the past and what it used to be in the time that I roamed its halls. The 1960s were a good time for 657 Blvd, when I ran from room to room imagining the life with the rich occupants there. The house was full of life and young blood. And then it got old, and so did my father. But he kept watching until the day that he died. And now I watch and wait for the day when young blood will be mine again. 657 Blvd is turning on me. It's coming after me, and I don't understand why. What spell did you cast on it? It used to be my friend, and now it's my enemy. I'm in charge of 657 Blvd. It is not in charge of me. I will fend off its bad things and wait for it to become good again. It will not punish me. I will rise again. I will be patient and wait for this to pass, and for you to bring the young blood back to me. 657 Blvd needs young blood. It needs you. Come back. Let the young blood play again like I once did. Let the young blood sleep in 657 Blvd. Stop changing it and let it alone." The Broadduses were done with these letters. They were completely over it, and I cannot say that I blame them. They took all three of the letters to the police to see what they might be able to make of it. And at first, my thoughts were, this has to be somebody that used to live in the house as a kid in the 60s. They keep talking about roaming the halls in the 60s and, how fancy everything is. But then I kept reading it and reading it and reading it. And the letter also says that the watcher used to watch all of the rich people and wonder what it might be like to be one of them. Which, same. But anyways. So maybe the watcher was the kid of someone that used to work for the owners of the house when they were young in the 60s, like a paid cook, a landscaper, a cleaning lady. There were a lot of jobs where you could take your kid to work in the 60s. But whoever's writing these letters seems to be jealous of anybody that's able to afford to live in this house. Like, whoever's writing this letter feels like they deserve some kind of recognition for watching this house and looking over this house all these years. And the police do actually look into it. They start looking into the postmarks on the envelopes, and they start questioning people. The police find that the letters had been processed in the northern part of New Jersey in Kearney. So Detective Lugo was in charge of this investigation, and he had read all three of the letters, so he asked the Broadduses to show him around the house. Maybe he would see something or notice something that an untrained eye just wouldn't notice or know to look for. And as they're walking around the outside of the property, Detective Lugo does notice something that may be a clue. He notices a kid's art easel outside on the front porch. But when he started looking around, he also started to notice that you wouldn't be able to see the art easel from the street. You would only be able to see it if you were standing behind the house or looking at the house from either side. because there were bushes blocking that part of the enclosed porch in the front of the house at the time. And remember, the watcher asked in the letters if their daughter was the artist of the family. And I would assume that doesn't seem like enough personal information to freak Derek and Maria out. But it really was something as small as a kid's art easel sitting on the front porch that the watcher used to make this assumption to freak them out. And during all of this, Derek and Maria are still in contact with the previous owners, the Woods. They had still been talking back and forth through emails, and Andrea Wood started telling Maria about one of the men that lived in the house next door. Andrea said that a lady named Peggy Langford, who was 90 years old, lived in the house with her 3 adult sons, who were all over the age of 60. One of Peggy's sons was named Michael Langford, and he didn't have a job, but he was also kind of misunderstood, uncomfortable to be around. People thought he was a little bit weird, stuff like that. But we find out later that Michael Langford had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, so that would explain some of that. But since the letters had mentioned the construction crew and the renovations and other things that only somebody who had a lot of time and who was home all day to watch the comings and goings of the neighborhood would probably be the most solid suspect. Which also, can we stop assuming that everyone that doesn't act the way that you think they should is a bad person? That would be great. So, after being told about the Langfords, Derek and Maria kind of put it together. They put it together that the kid's easel was probably the artist part of the letter, but also that the kid's easel was in plain view of the Langford house. The Broadduses also learned that the Langford family had lived in that same house since the 60s, which is the same time that the watcher supposedly roamed the halls of the 657 Blvd house. I also found that a man named Richard Langford had died in 2002, and from what I could put together, that was Peggy's husband. So the part of the letter that said that the watcher's dad had been watching the house for 2 decades would also make sense. So if Richard died in 2002, then it would make sense that now that it would be Michael's turn to watch the house. And as many times as the house address is mentioned in the letters, it has to hold some kind of importance to the writer of the letters. And it would also have to be somebody who's pretty close by. I can't see somebody writing and sending letters from, 4 counties over. It doesn't make sense. So after Derek and Maria put all this stuff together about the Langfords that live next door, that the Woods family that previously owned the home had told them about, they mentioned it to the detective. But, as it turns out, Detective Lugo told them that he had already looked into the Langfords and that they had already been questioned a week before the Broadduses had ever even brought this information to his attention. So, Detective Lugo is on top of it. But when Detective Lugo went to talk to the Langford family about the letters, Michael and the rest of the family denied knowing anything about the letters at all. Also, now, if it wasn't Michael that was writing them, he at least knows about the letters now. And he would probably be telling other people in the neighborhood about the letters too. So there went the whole don't tell any of the neighbors thing. But the detective was actually taking this seriously, which I will say that I absolutely do not think that my local police department would take something like this seriously. They would tell us to stop watching so many scary movies and to lock our doors and have a good night. I also read that one of the neighbors that lived directly behind the Broaddus' house had a back porch that they always had chairs sitting outside on. And that the Broadduses thought it was a little bit weird that there were always people just sitting outside on the porch. But my papa just sits on his porch chilling all day long. He just watches the squirrels and birds and deer, and I don't find that weird. Some people enjoy being outside. Not me, but some people. Detective Lugo even went so far as to swab the letters and envelopes for fingerprints and DNA and anything else that he might be able to use. And even though the letters sounded threatening, there wasn't an actual threat made to anyone in any of the letters. Like, they all sounded like, I'm watching you and I know what your kids are doing. And, even the part where he says, once I figure out which room everybody's sleeping in, I'll be able to plan better. That sounds threatening, but he didn't say, I'll be able to plan to come in and kidnap your kids. It sounds threatening, but there was no actual threat ever made. Even though Detective Lugo said that the way that Michael talked and the way that the letters were written That was hard to say. They didn't sound similar, but, you can't arrest somebody for talking the same way that a weird letter's written. So there wasn't a whole lot more that the detective could do from here. Derek and Maria decided that they would handle this themselves. So they installed security cameras, and Derek got a little crazy with it. He started keeping up with who was coming and going at all hours of the day. He started keeping track of people that were moving into the neighborhood and basically mapping out their view of his house, what different angles the neighbors could see his house from. He was on some real-life Inspector Gadget type of stuff. He was even trying to figure out which neighbors were close enough to hear them talking. Like, how else would they have known his kids' names and nicknames? And apparently, Derek even pulled the sex offender registry for his neighborhood, which is something that we should all do about every 6 months, because you just don't know what kind of people live near you, and you will be shocked. You would be amazed at the amount of sex offenders in your neighborhood that you think is a safe, quiet place. Moving on. For Derek's next trick, he went all the way in on this one. Derek hired former FBI agent Robert Lanahan to come in and do some threat assessments. The ex-FBI agent came up with a profile, like real-life Criminal Minds profile. And the profile that former FBI agent Robert Lanahan came up with said that it was believed to either be a former employee of the house that used to live there, someone that the family employed. He also thought that the watcher was just acting out of jealousy, even guessing that this was somebody playing off of the movie called The Watcher, which was basically a movie about a serial killer who stalks the detectives. The profile also said that the person writing the letters was probably an older writer because of the grammar and the dramatics, but also because the letters were typed, but they were all double-spaced, which isn't something that I'm in the habit of doing, and I don't know a lot of people that are. So Derek is still suspecting the Langfords, but he concocted a plan to send out a message to the neighborhood that says that basically the new owners are going to have the house demolished. There was more to it than that, though. The plan was actually to tear the house down and split the house into 2 separate lots. And he would build 2 separate smaller houses where 657 Boulevard stood then. They couldn't sell the house because they were legally obligated to let any prospective buyers read the letters, and that would be a no. They did try, but everyone who was interested in buying 657 Boulevard would read the letters and immediately back out of the sale, which, same. They figured that whoever was writing these letters obviously had some kind of obsession with the house, a personal connection with it, or some kind of sentimental value. So they were hoping to provoke the writer and get another letter sent to them. They did this like a bait 'em and wait type of thing, and they didn't get a letter like they thought they would. So Derek and Maria decided to go ahead with the plan to tear the house down and build 2 separate smaller houses, and hopefully that would be the end of the letters. But when they went to get the approval and the permits, everything got denied. Apparently there had to be at least 70 feet between each house, and if they built and went through with their plans, their houses would have only been 67 feet apart. So that's a no-go. So eventually the Broadduses were done with all of this. They filed a lawsuit against the Woodses, basically saying that they should have known about the letters and the threats of the letters way before they closed on the house. And this isn't the same as if somebody died in the house you're about to buy, or if the septic tank backs up when it rains a lot. This isn't exactly the same thing. This isn't something that you would have to tell somebody before they buy your house and you move into it. Non-threatening letters are not something that you have to disclose before selling your house. And the letter that the Woods got wasn't even a little bit threatening. So, of course, the lawsuit was thrown out because as serious as the situation had to have seemed to them, it doesn't seem like this is something as serious as like black mold or a cave-in roof or a crumbling foundation that an inspector missed. It's ominous letters, nothing more, nothing less. So after this, people started to speculate that maybe it was the Broaddus family that were behind the letters. But in the same breath, I say that, I can also say that they weren't telling anybody about the letters that they had gotten. There were news reports and newspapers that were trying to get the story from the Broaddus family, but Derek and Maria weren't speaking a word about it. So what good would it do for them to write letters and still not get their 15 minutes of fame for making it a big public thing? I just don't understand the motive behind it. They wouldn't gain anything from the letters being publicized, so I can't wrap my mind around that part. Because at this point, they had sold their old house and they were too afraid for their kids' safety to move into their dream house, so the family ended up having to move into Maria's parents' house. Why would they write those letters, lose out on the house, not be able to sell it, pay all the money for the renovations, and then have to move in with Maria's parents? So now the only valid option that Derek and Maria had was to try to rent the house out to some brave soul, because I can tell you, ain't no way I'm moving in. Because at this point, everybody did know about the letters. Newspapers, news stations, reporters, they were reporting on the letters. So whoever moved in and rented the house would have probably already known, but even if they didn't know, they would soon find out. And Derek and Maria even added a part into the lease for anybody that wanted to rent the house that said that they would void their lease at no penalty if they got another letter sent to the house. And of course, it wouldn't be long after the new renters moved in that they would get another letter at 657 Blvd. This letter read, "Violent winds and bitter cold, to the vile and spiteful Derek and his wench of a wife Maria. You wonder who the watcher is? Turn around, you idiots. Maybe you even spoke to me. One of the so-called neighbors who has no idea who the watcher could be. Or maybe you do know, and you're too scared to tell anyone. Good move. I walked by the news trucks when they took over the neighborhood and mocked me. I watch as you watch from a dark house in an attempt to find me. Telescopes and binoculars are wonderful inventions. 657 Blvd survived your attempted assault and stood strong, with its army of supporters barricading its gates. My soldiers of the Blvd followed my orders to a T. They carried out their mission and saved 657 Blvd with my orders. All hail the watcher. Maybe a car accident. Maybe a fire. Maybe something as simple as a mild illness that never seems to go away but makes you feel sick day after day after day after day. Maybe a mysterious death of a pet. Loved one suddenly dies. Planes and cars and bicycles crash and bones break. Whoa. So this letter makes me think that the watcher is on the board of a committee that denied them the rights to tear down the house to split it into two separate ones. Because not long after they got denied, someone else got approved to do the same exact thing that the Broadduses were trying to do, and once they tore their house down and split it into two, it was even less than the 67 feet that Derek and Maria's two separate houses would have been, yet it still got approved. The DNA that was found on the letters ended up being female DNA, so that kind of ruled Michael Langsford out, but that did put his sister Abby as a person of interest, but they did test her DNA also, and it wasn't a match, so that kind of rules 2 out of however many Langsfords there are out. So after this, basically having to start completely over from scratch, Derek was struggling with depression and Maria was struggling from PTSD from the letters. They had went from their dream home and starting a new chapter in their life to not even being able to rent the house out and having to move in with Maria's parents. And like I said before, most people believe that these letters were either done by the Broadduses themselves or it was just a prank or a hoax that just went way too far. And after their plans for building the 2 separate smaller houses on the lot of land fell through, the board members that denied their plans got a letter of their own. After looking into that a little more, Derek admitted that he had written the letters to the board that denied his proposal. He apologized and said that he was just angry. But he still adamantly denies that he wrote the watcher letters. So I guess we'll never know. People that know Michael Langsford personally say that there's absolutely no way that it was him. That he does do things that make people uncomfortable, but he doesn't do them out of anger or malicious intent. He may walk through neighbors' yards and look into the new people moving in, but he does this as an act to show them that he's glad that they're there and that he's happy. He's curious and has never been violent or threatening. So let's shift that focus away from Michael, especially since the DNA was female. The Broaddus family did end up selling the house 5 years after they bought it, but they took a $400,000 loss, and there is a Netflix show about this, which not really, because it took a really weird turn that I didn't expect, which I should have expected because it's Netflix. But according to The Cut, the amount that Netflix bought the rights to the story for didn't even cover their $400,000 loss. So that should say something. Derek and Maria have avoided any interviews and try to stay out of the public eye. They did have to tell their kids about the letters, well, because it blew up after people found out about it. The new owners have, of course, remained anonymous. They do not want their names out there, and I do not blame them. And that is all for this week. I'm really sorry for my voice. I'm really sorry if you've heard this already when I did it on Murder Inc. And I'm really sorry that it's just a few days before Christmas and I didn't have time to do anything else. I have most of a case done that I plan to record. I just didn't have time to finish the research and actually type out the notes. That's my fault. So I'll try to do something next week to make it up. We'll see. I'm not making promises because Santa's coming soon and your girl will be doing too much for Christmas. And that is all for this week. I will see you here, same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.